Picture a 20-year-old kid standing in a room full of grown men. His father is dead, stabbed in broad daylight at a wedding just days earlier. Half the kingdom expects this new king to be crushed within the year. Rival cities are already plotting revolt, and neighboring tribes smell weakness and start moving. Everyone in that room is waiting to see if this boy folds. He didn't. Within 2 years, he'd crushed every single one of them. And within 13 years, he'd built an empire stretching from Greece to India, doing it without ever losing a battle. Not one. Not against armies 5 times his size, not against elephants, not against fortresses nobody thought could fall. That's Alexander the Great. Most people know the highlight reel, but what most people don't know is just how brutal, how strange, and how personally exhausting that path actually was. Let's start before the crown, because the man who built that empire was shaped years before he ever wore it. Alexander was born in 356 BC, the son of King Philip II of Macedon. Philip was already one of the most dangerous military minds in the Greek world, a king who'd rebuilt his army from scratch into something faster and better organized than anything nearby kingdoms could field. So growing up in that household meant growing up around war, strategy, and constant political danger, since assassination attempts and palace intrigue were basically background noise in Macedonian royal life. His education wasn't ordinary either. Philip hired Aristotle, yes, that Aristotle, to personally tutor his son for several years. Alexander studied philosophy, medicine, science, and literature under one of the greatest minds in human history, and by most accounts developed a lifelong obsession with Homer's Iliad specifically. He reportedly kept a copy under his pillow during military campaigns for the rest of his life. He wanted to be Achilles, and he basically got his wish. Then there's the horse story, which sounds made up, but isn't. When Alexander was around 12, a horse trader brought a wild, unrideable stallion named Bucephalus to Philip's court. Nobody could control the animal. Grown men, experienced horsemen, all failed and got humiliated trying. But Alexander noticed something the others missed. The horse was afraid of its own shadow, so he calmly turned the animal to face the sun, mounted him, and rode him without issue. Philip reportedly told his son that Macedonia was too small for his ambitions. Bucephalus stayed with Alexander for the rest of the horse's life through years of campaigning, and Alexander later founded a city named after him when the horse finally died. In 336 BC, everything changed at once. Philip was assassinated at his own daughter's wedding, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards for reasons historians still debate. Alexander was 20 years old, and the moment his father died, the entire region treated it as an opportunity. Greek city-states that had been forced into Macedonian alliances started plotting to break free. Neighboring tribes to the north began testing the borders. Everyone assumed a 20-year-old couldn't hold what his father built. His response was immediate and violent. He marched south into Greece before anyone finished planning their revolt and forced the city-states back into submission through sheer speed. But when the city of Thebes rose up anyway, believing false rumors that Alexander had died fighting in the north, he made an example that sent a message across the entire Greek world. Thebes was destroyed, the city was leveled, and thousands of its people were sold into slavery. It was brutal, but it worked. No other Greek city seriously challenged him again. With Greece secured, Alexander turned toward the real target, the Persian Empire, the largest and wealthiest empire the world had ever seen, ruled by King Darius III. In 334 BC, he crossed into Asia with an army that was, by any reasonable comparison, badly outnumbered. His first major battle came at the Granicus River, where he personally led cavalry charges close enough to combat that he nearly died, saved at one point by an officer who cut down a Persian soldier about to kill him from behind. This became a pattern. Alexander didn't command from a safe distance behind his lines, he fought personally constantly in the thick of it, and that's part of why his soldiers followed him with the kind of loyalty that doesn't come from just winning battles. Then there's the Gordian Knot, a story so strange it sounds invented, except multiple ancient historians recorded versions of it. Legend held that whoever untied an impossibly complex knot tied to an old chariot would become ruler of Asia. Alexander examined it, apparently couldn't find the ends, and simply cut it in half with his sword. It was symbolic and dramatic, exactly the kind of move that built his legend in real time while it was happening. At Issus in 333 BC, Alexander faced Darius directly for the first time, and routed his army so completely that Darius abandoned his own camp, leaving behind his mother, wife, and children. Alexander treated them with notable respect rather than cruelty, and that decision added to his growing reputation across the region. Then came Tyre, a fortified island city that had never been successfully besieged in its history. Alexander's solution was to build an entire land bridge out into the sea to physically connect the mainland to the island so his army could reach the walls. It took 7 months, but it worked. Tyre fell. By 332 BC, Alexander had taken Egypt, where he was welcomed as a liberator rather than a conqueror, since the Egyptians had their own grievances with Persian rule. He founded the city of Alexandria there, one of dozens of cities he'd eventually name after himself, and traveled to the remote oracle at Siwa, where, according to ancient accounts, he received some kind of confirmation of divine parentage that he apparently took seriously for the rest of his life. The decisive blow against Persia came at Gaugamela in 331 BC, where Alexander's smaller, more disciplined force broke Darius's massive army through superior tactics and battlefield instinct. Darius fled again, and was later killed by his own men rather than face Alexander directly. Just like that, the Persian Empire was finished. Here's where the story gets more complicated. After capturing the Persian capital of Persepolis, Alexander's army burned the royal palace to the ground. Ancient sources disagree on exactly why. Some say it was calculated revenge for Persia's earlier destruction of Athens generations before, while others describe a drunken party that spiraled out of control. Either way, one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world was reduced to ash under his command. Victory didn't stop him. Alexander kept pushing east into territory no Greek army had ever seen, and eventually reached India. At the Hyphasis River in 326 BC, he faced King Porus, and an army that included war elephants, animals his soldiers had never fought against before. He won anyway, through a combination of tactical brilliance and sheer nerve, and was reportedly impressed enough by Porus's courage that he let him keep his kingdom as an ally instead of executing him. But by this point, his own army had had enough. At the Hyphasis River, after years of continuous warfare, thousands of miles from home, Alexander's soldiers finally refused to go any further east. This wasn't defeat by an enemy, it was mutiny by exhaustion. For the first time in his life, Alexander had to accept that his own men had a limit he didn't, so he turned back. And the return journey might be the most brutal chapter of the entire story, one that rarely makes it into the highlight reel. Alexander led a portion of his army through the Gedrosian Desert, a punishing stretch of terrain in modern-day Iran and Pakistan. Ancient historians described it as worse than anything the army had endured in actual combat, and modern historians still argue over the exact numbers. But the estimates are staggering regardless. Somewhere between half and 3/4 of the people who entered that desert, soldiers, camp followers, and civilians alike, never made it out. Flash floods, starvation, and unbearable heat did what no Persian army ever managed to do to Alexander's forces. He survived it, and his empire survived it too. But something had clearly changed. In 300 to 23 BC, back in Babylon, still only 32 years old, Alexander fell ill and died within roughly 2 weeks. What actually killed him remains genuinely unresolved. Ancient sources point toward possibilities ranging from malaria to typhoid fever to complications from heavy drinking, and some later accounts even raised the possibility of poison, though most modern historians lean toward natural illness rather than assassination. He reportedly never named a clear successor, and when advisors asked who should inherit his empire, he allegedly answered simply that it should go to the strongest. His empire fractured into pieces almost immediately after his death, fought over by his own generals for decades. There's a reason this story still gets told the same way, 23 centuries later. Alexander never lost a battle. He fought on the front lines instead of hiding behind his army, crossed deserts, besieged unbeatable cities, and built the largest empire the ancient Mediterranean world had ever seen, all before turning 33. But that same relentless ambition that made him unstoppable on the battlefield also marched his own men into a desert that killed thousands of them for no strategic reason beyond his own restless need to keep pushing forward. He wasn't just fearless, he genuinely didn't seem to know how to stop, and in the end, neither his body nor his empire could keep up with him.